and he was sufficiently greedy for power, and sufficiently ruthless in the methods which he was prepared to use to try and attain the power which he desired, for the Freemasons to be able to discredit him entirely once the war was over. In effect, Hitler was used by the Freemasons to bring about his own destruction, whilst at the same time providing them with the situation from which they could make handsome profits out of the war, and from which they could eventually increase their control on a worldwide basis. The Second World War provided nearly every country after the war with sufficient reason to amass vast quantities of armaments, thereby providing the Freemasons with countless potential conflict situations to exploit. For it is inevitable that once a country has arms, there is going to emerge someone who wants to use them. That someone is given backing by the Freemasons, who also help the people opposed to that someone, on the understanding that the winner of the conflict will then return past favors, usually by purchasing more arms, borrowing more money on interest, and giving Freemasonic-backed corporations favorable contracts to establish the producer-consumer process in the country in question and to exploit its natural resources. Since the Freemasons back both sides in the conflict, without either of the two sides realizing it, the outcome of the conflict is immaterial, since the Freemasons cannot lose, whichever side wins. As with Pound, the Freemasons had to come up with an effective counter-move at the end of the Second World War in order to effectively discredit Hitler's ideas, by portraying him as a man who was so insane that nothing which he had said could possibly be believed to have contained any truth. Having used Hitler to create a profitable conflict situation, the Freemasons had to then disassociate themselves, nor only from any involvement in his rise and downfall, and the overall orchestration of the war, but also from the many truths which were undoubtedly voiced by Hitler concerning their activities. Since Hitler was himself a kafir, this task was relatively simple. Although Hitler was aware of the Freemasons' bid for world control, he did not have access to the only viable alternative to the kafir system. That is the Dajjal system, that is, trust in Allah, and a way of life based on the way of life embodied by the Prophet Muhammad and followed by the community which formed around him at Medina al-Munawwara, that is, the illuminated place where the life transaction is. May the blessings and peace of Allah be on him and them. Indeed, Hitler did not even have any of the ideals which Ezra Pound had possessed. Like the Freemasons, all that he wanted was power. In effect, Hitler wished to beat the Freemasons at their own game, by replacing their pyramidical power structure with his own pyramidical power structure. Lane, the final analysis. The Second Kafir World War was merely a power struggle between Kafir powers, and not a confrontation between Iman and Kufr. That is, a struggle between those who accept the wisdom of the prophetic lifestyle and those who reject it, although, of course, there were individuals on both sides who found themselves unwillingly swept up in the conflict, and whose only way of keeping sane was by trusting in Allah. There was even one Muslim colonel from Hyderabad who decided to fight for the English on the basis that if the Germans won the war, they would be so efficient in running the kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, that it would take twice as long for it to reach the state of collapse, which it has now reached today. Allah says in the Quran that although the Kafirun appear to be one body, they are divided against each other. Since Hitler was unaware of the degree of control which the Freemasons already exercised over the Western world, he was foolish enough to imagine that he could succeed in his power bid for world domination. The Freemasons, on the other hand, knew that they would win the war even before they encouraged Hitler into starting it. The only losers were the people who were unfortunate enough to be misled into fighting in it. One of the main purposes of the Second World, the only losers were the people who were unfortunate enough to be misled into fighting in it. One of the main purposes of the Second World War was to increase the extent of the territory now controlled by the communists, who had seized power in Russia under cover of the First World War. This is why war was declared on Germany, but not Russia, even though Russia also invaded Poland before the Second World War began. And even though Russia ended up occupying all of Poland and half of Germany after the war had ended. One of the Freemasons' main concerns was the cover-up job, which it was essential should be performed once the war was over. Their task was twofold. Firstly, it was necessary to discredit Hitler's views on Freemasonic meddling and manipulation in world affairs by giving them as little publicity as possible, and by bringing him into utter disrepute. Secondly, it was necessary to create the impression that the actions which had arisen as a result of those views were other than what they really were. Hitler's views, especially his critique and condemnation of usury, had to be represented as the imaginings of a madman, and accordingly without any basis of truth or accuracy. His actions, and the actions of those who followed him, had to be portrayed as the horrifying manifestation of the insane prejudices of a racially prejudiced tyrant, rather than the misguided attempts of a man who was trying to free Europe from the stranglehold control of the Freemasons, but unfortunately by using the wrong methods. Many of Hitler's views were either derived from or reinforced by rediscovery and publication of the Protocol of the Learned Elders of Zion, a small book, originally written in Russian, and published by Sergei Nilus in 1905, possession of which was punished by death at the time of the communist takeover in Russia, and which presents a partial yet informative outline of the Freemasonic blueprint for world control, the New World Order. The contents of the protocols merely reinforced what Hitler had himself already observed in the way of Freemasonic control exercised by what he called the dictatorship of the World Stock Exchange, the monopoly of raw materials, the control of land, if not its ownership, and, above all, usury in all its forms. The Freemasons, who at that stage of takeover had already gained almost complete control of the media in the Western world, entered a highly energetic cover-up campaign designed not only to establish the idea that TB protocols were a forgery, but also, and more important, to affirm that there was no truth in the contents of the protocol whatsoever. Newspaper articles to this effect appeared in all the leading publications of the Western world, including the Times, once Lord Northcliffe had been removed, and indeed, even still continue to appear occasionally today. The two most popular stories as to the origins of the protocols were, firstly, that they could be traced back to a satirical dialogue between Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell, aimed at Napoleon III, and published as part of the German novel Bayeritz, and secondly, that they were alleged to have been composed during the last few years of the 19th century by members of the Russian secret police in Paris, who had drawn their ideas from a French pamphlet written by a French lawyer called Maurice Joly. This cover-up campaign culminated in the matter being taken before a Swiss Freemasonic-controlled court, which, having directed that the provisions of the Swiss Civil Code would not apply to the hearing, and having permitted only one of the 40 defense witnesses to give evidence, and having allowed the plaintiffs to appoint 2 private stenographers, instead of court stenographer, to keep the official record of the evidence given by their 16 witnesses, duly gave the desired declaration on the May 14, 1935, after the case had lasted nearly 2 years, in favor of the Swiss-Israelitic Alliance and the Israelitic congregation in Bern, and indeed, for the benefit of Freemasons in general, that the protocols were a deliberate forgery, probably originating in the Paris offices of the Russian political police, and intended for use by the Tsarist government against Russian liberals. It is not altogether surprising that, in view of all the procedural irregularities which had taken place, the Swiss Court of Criminal Appeal quashed this judgment in its entirety on the last of November 1937. It should perhaps be mentioned in passing that although the Khazar Jews continue to claim that Telt Protocol of the Learned Elders of Zion is a horrifying old forgery, whose circulation on the open market they have gone to such great lengths to prevent, there is, as Henry Ford once pointed out in 1921, A strong resemblance between what the protocol originally envisaged and proposed, and what has since happened and is actually now taking place. They have fitted the world situation up to this time. They fit it now. Whether it be the creation of the United Nations at an international level, the world government of the proposed New World Order, or the creation of highly regulated police states at a national level, or the creation of economic impotence through interest-based debts and crippling taxation at a community level, or the creation of confusion and sexual immorality by spreading false political and social theories amongst the Goyim, those who are not Jews, through the media at an individual level, or the introduction of organized sport to replace institutionalized religious worship at every level. To give but a few examples, a forgery is either an imitation of something original or the creation of something that purports to be an original. A good forgery is often so close to the original that there is virtually no difference between them, or else it is so accurate that it is as true as an original, even if it was nor created by whoever is said to have created it. In other words, a forgery is capable of not misrepresenting whatever it purports to imitate or describe. Even if the protocol of the learned elders of Zion is a forgery, which has never been conclusively proved to be the case, it may be that much of what it describes is nevertheless true. Whether it be fact or fiction, it still makes interesting reading. The reader will have to satisfy him or herself as to where the truth lies by reading the protocols, if that is possible. As in the case of Pound's writings, the Freemasons who control the publishing business and its distribution outlets have ensured that virtually all copies of the protocols and any translations thereof have long been withdrawn from the market for public consumption. Similarly, the writings of Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of Hitler's men and who wrote extensively on the protocols, and who, amongst other things, traced the sources of the Russian Revolution back to Freemasonic activity, were and continue to be withdrawn from the general public's gaze, as well as withdrawing all written records of Hyder's views, which were damaging to the image of the Freemasons. Literally hundreds of books, backed by other media presentations on radio and on the screen, were written and broadcasted in order to distort what Hitler had actually been saying. Very few people today know what Hitler actually said or believed. His views have been covered over by a barrage of emotional invective, which has prevented the vast majority of people today from actually being in a position to coolly and critically examine what he actually had to say, in order to see what truth, if any, there was in his words. If you asked people today what motivated Hitler in his actions, most of them will give a predictable involuntary shiver and dutifully come out with the Freemasonic media manufactured picture of a tyrant who was irrationally prejudiced against the Jews, for no reason other than that they were Jews. There is no doubt that Hitler did hate some Jews, but he did have his reasons, and some of them are understandable. As far as Hitler's actions and the actions of those who followed him are concerned, they were clearly excessive, and this made it all the easier for the Freemasons to portray them as being far more excessive than they really were. It is always easier to exaggerate something that has happened than to invent something which never even happened at all. The Freemasons took full advantage of this in their attempts to depict Hyder and his followers as fanatical, racist madmen who wished to utterly destroy all Jews altogether and to establish the Aryan master race, using highly emotive techniques of media manipulation, which include the display of the incriminating close-up, but not the overall picture, backed up by highly loaded vocabulary. The Freemasons were highly successful in pouring Hitler as a disordered, paranoid psychopath who was imagining a conspiracy which did nor exist, in order to justify his purely racist and entirely irrational discriminatory prejudice and heart of the Jews as a whole. Of course, there was some truth in their allegations, but they maintained, through the media systems, that this was the whole truth, when in fact large vistas of the truth had been omitted from the picture which had been prepared for the general public. Thus, for example, Douglas Reed, who was the Times newspaper's chief correspondent for Central Europe and the Balkans in the 1930s, wrote in his book TB Controversy of Zion, "In the case of the Jewish persecution in Germany, I found that impartial presentation of the facts gradually gave way to so partisan a depiction that the truth was lost. This transformation was effected in three subtle stages. First, the persecution of political opponents and Jews was reported. Then this was imperceptibly amended to Jews and political opponents, and at the end, the press in general spoke only of the persecution of Jews. By this means a false image was projected onto the public mind, and the plight of the overwhelming majority of the victims, by this fixing of the spotlight on one group, was lost to sight." The result showed in 1945, when, on the one hand, the persecution of Jews was made the subject of a formal indictment or Nuremberger, and on the other hand half of Europe and all the people in it were abandoned to the selfsame persecution, in which the Jews had shared in their small proportion to populations everywhere.